Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here.
Maybe you should put it close.
This is going to be a conversation mainly based on Arundhathi Subramaniam's poetry. She has also been a fantastic translator and a facilitator of translations and an editor of translated poetry. So I'm going to start by talking about the book that she edited of Bhakti poetry. This included actually works by different Bhakti poets in different Indian languages from the 8th to the 18th century. And the book is called Eating God. And these translations are actually also varied. They range from A.K. Ramanujan to Dilip Chitre to Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. And she also actually has picked some unusual choices of Bhakti poets. When I say unusual, I mean names that we may not otherwise have been familiar with. And there's also a very strong element of transgressive, subversive, radical kind of bhakti in her own poetry, which we will come to. In fact, I mean, you know, I actually, Arundhathi, I understand bhakti itself actually as transgressive. And I'm curious as to how you made your selections as editor in this volume, Eating God.
I just want to say at the start, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Sabitha. I've just met her, though we've actually corresponded on occasion on email. And this is the perfect kind of conversation to have, actually, with someone whom you've never actually met. And so the questions that unfold become real questions, and hopefully some of the answers will be real answers as well. It's almost difficult to go back and talk about Eating God because it's a book that meant a great deal to me. But it's a book I've done lots of readings from. But it already seems at some remove. And there's one part of me that's itching to put together another kind of anthology as well. But for now...
You should tell us about that a bit later.
It's premature, but I'm just itching to do it, I think. Let's see how it unfolds. But I'll say this about Eating God, that my impetus was just this. You know, when you come to the choices you're talking about, my impetus was really to choose voices that were as diverse as possible. And I was quite clear from the start that I didn't want this to be an anthology that was organized along regional or linguistic or sectarian lines. I wanted this to be, or chronological. I wanted to organize this on the basis of tone, because for me that is really at the heart of Bhakti. I would say if I had to choose a single word that is really the cornerstone of Bhakti poetry, it is intimacy. And that intimacy is so scorching, so radical, that it allows for every conceivable tone. And that excites me about this poetry. The fact that you can yearn for this God, or goddess, the fact that you can yearn for him or her, that you can love him or her, that you can want to make love to him or her, that you can throw a tantrum in verse and consider it a prayer. The fact that nothing is blasphemous, nothing sacrilegious, everything is permissible, simply because all of it is rooted in this relationship of intimacy. To me, this excites me hugely. And so the entire anthology was organized along the lines of tone, moving from yearning to passionate longing to erotic love to rage. There are several poets in this book who rage at God. There's Namdev who hurls cuss words at God. The Ninda Stuti becomes an important form, which is really a tantrum. It's poets throwing a tantrum at God, shaking a fist at God. And that becomes a kind of devotional poem as well. And finally, there's ecstasy and extinction. So I wanted that, Sabitha. I wanted that mix of tones.
You know, your selection, which ranges really from Kabir to Mira to Damalwar to Lal Ded to Namdev to Desamaya, and actually some other poets who I discovered through you, Soirabai. So you know, so she has chosen actually a kind of range of poetry of Bhakti poets who engage Bhakti in very diverse ways. I mean, I think eroticism that you speak about is one aspect of it. There is definitely eroticism in Andal's relationship with God. It is as a lover that she's speaking to God. Meera, again, right? She's speaking to God as a lover. However, there is also the submissive faithful, right? I mean, there is also kind of sadomasochistic relationship with God, where, which is actually also there somewhat in Meera, where the beloved is raging at the lover, cursing him and asking him to come and do things to her, to even punish her, for example. So there are all those elements. Even within eroticism, there are diverse elements. There is the naked poet. There are two naked saint poets here, Andal and Lal Ded, and Akka Mahadevi. Sorry. So you have, there is also the relationship with the body, which is both transcendental as well as very rooted here, very much physical. So how do you actually, when you talk about tones then, right, as one thing that you were looking at in terms of binding this diversity together, what about relationships with physicality, with the body, whether as the submissive faithful or as somebody who's doing nindastuti to God, being angry at God, asking God, why did you do this to me, why have you... So you can actually curse at God in Bhakti poetry, and also in Sufi poetry that happens. And so, these diverse ways of engaging in those intimacies.
And you're right. I mean, it's some of it can be disquieting for a modern reader, I think. And one of the briefs that I actually gave Rahul Soni, who's at this festival, but I don't think he's here. Rahul Soni was my translator of Meera. And I specifically asked him to translate certain poems. So I wanted this particular poem, for instance, where Meera actually sends this bird to her god. She calls it her fever bird. And she says, I'll tear off your wings, I'll rub salt in your beak if you don't bring him to me. There's a kind of dark, disquieting Meera here, So it's not the Meera of easy lyrical abandon, which is often the way she's perceived, not necessarily the way she was, but the way she is perceived. So I did want to have tones that in some way challenge our own preconceptions about some of these poets. Not decorative, beautiful yearning, but passionate, unsettling yearning as well. When it comes to the body, Sabitha, I'd say there are poems in the book that talk of the perishability of the body, the fact that the body is a source of filth, that it is subject to decay, phlegm, blood. This is the receptacle of all of that. But I also wanted poems, and there are a fair share of those, that actually acknowledge that the body is a stepping stone, not an impediment. And I think that's the famous Basavarna poem. The moving temples are the ones that last. There is Soirabai, whom you mention, who says she's a Dalit woman mystic of the 14th century. And she says, if menstrual blood makes me impure, show me who was not born of that blood. So there are voices like this that constantly extend our ideas of what constitutes the physical and what that might mean. And in a sense, what excites me about these poets is that they're not merely questioning, many of the hierarchies that we're talking about in terms of gender, caste, class, and so on. They're also questioning the ultimate hierarchy between the human and the divine. They're actually saying, finally, even that hierarchy has to be dropped. So whether it's the bhakta in a state of submission, or whether it is the divine in a state of submission, there are both in this book. There are many poems, Narsi Metta for instance, and many of the male mystics interest me for this reason, because there are many of the male mystics who actually adopt the female voice. And Narsi Metta has his gopi tying Krishna's arms to the bedpost. You know? There's another one in which Krishna, in Narsi Metta's poem, engages in a spot of cross-dressing. So you really don't know, is this Krishna? Is this Radha? You really don't know the difference. Is this the human? Is this the divine? You really don't know the difference. So those boundaries being blurred time and again, I realized is this tremendous power that was actually made possible for many male poets when they chose to adopt the female voice. So Annamacharya, the Telugu poet of the 15th century, has a poem in which, a very short poem, in which the woman, it's a woman speaker, and she happens to be a goddess, which is lovely because she's a temperamental and feisty goddess. In the course of a really small poem, you have this goddess saying about her lord, he's my master and he's my slave. She says it in this bewildering fashion, so by the end of it you really don't know what's going on. Who is the boss? Who is the slave? You're left confused. And that's the whole point of intimacy of this kind. And you realize that the closer you get to this molten place where definitions and roles are almost irrelevant.
Even hierarchies.
And hierarchies are in such a state of disarray that you're going to encounter more and more of this, you know?
Coming back to the body, which is actually very, very crucial in her own poetry, there is this poem by Nammalvar, I'm sure you remember that, I just remember 2 lines from it. Who is this coming towards me? Is it man or woman? Oh, but it is my God, right? So the God of, who's Nammalvar's God?
Vishnu.
Vishnu, but the God, what does he call him in Tamil?
Are you thinking of the Devara Dasamaya poem?
No. I'm
You're
thinking
thinking of Nammalvar?
Nammalvar, where he's talking about who
He
is this
talks
coming towards
Krishna.
me? Yeah, Krishna. Who is this coming towards me? And what does he call him? Like Channa Malligeshwara. Yeah.
It's Krishna in
Yes,
most
yeah.
of the...
Yeah. So basically, there's this question of who is it that's coming towards me? Is it a man or a woman? And what does it matter anyway? How all these things are just roles that we have ascribed. And there's also Akka's famous poem, what need of a body for the one who has gone beyond the body, what need of clothes? For one who has become one with my God of jasmines, what need of the self? So, you know,
And there's a beautiful one which I always love to quote.
This is A.K. Ramanujan's translation.
A.K. Ramanujan's translation. And was that event here, incidentally, the A.K. Ramanujan event earlier? It just feels appropriate to be talking about Ramanujan here in a festival that has celebrated him just 2 sessions ago. But there's this marvelous translation by, I think this is a Devara Dasamaya poem, where he has the poet say to his God, you gave me a body, and then you ask me to transcend it. Is that fair? He says, why don't you take on a body for a change, O Lord, and then we can have this conversation. So these are the voices that for me are just such wonderful reminders of possible ways in which the sacred can be approached and celebrated.
At this point, I'd love you to read from Ninda Smriti. Ninda Stuti is a poem from Arundhathi's, where do I find it? Here, yeah, Ninda Stuti.
I'm afraid she's asking me to read one of my own poems, so we're going to be leaping a bit from Eating God to my most recent collection.
But then this is actually, I treat this as a transition from the book that she edited on Bhakti poetry to her own, because she's using the form of Ninda Stuti, which is kind of the quarrel with God. And we'll see what she does with it.
Actually, I specifically chose to call it Ninda Stuti, but I also chose to give it an epigraph from Hafiz, the Sufi poet, who has this wonderful line in a poem translated by Daniel Ladinsky, where he says, complaint is only possible when living in the suburbs of God. And that line stayed with me because it seemed like a bit of a South Bombay approach to God. And it stayed with me, and I started thinking about what it might mean to live in the suburbs of God. I'm afraid that's the place to which I've been consigned for a great deal of my life. Nindastuti. We are not impressed by your platoons of admirers, your raging eyes, your guest lists, your visiting cards, your 7-horse chariots, your LED screens. We aren't minor either. If it's about choosing between big and small, form and vacancy, we choose neither. If you're playing the game, we are too. We come from a tribe that knows that a versified tantrum is a kind of prayer. We turn invective into love, salty, sometimes sulfuric, and love into obscenity. Our longing reaches for the stars. Domesticated by our fury, even the skies turn terrestrial. And the rest of the time, the earth, this lunatic suburb, is plenty.
Beautiful, thank you. Now I want you to tell us something about your beginnings as a poet in Bombay. We are making a bit of a leap here, as in we're going back in time. What was it like to be, I mean, when you started writing poetry, the Bombay poetry scene, as we call it now, was very much actually in its peak, right? Everybody was still writing. Arun Koladkar, Dilip Chitre, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Jeet Style, who came later, and of course there were the big mentors before that, Domores, Nizam Ezekiel. So that's the kind of Bombay that you're writing in. And I sort of wonder what your relationship with the Bombay poets, if one can, I don't think there is such a thing as Bombay poets, but for want of a better term, the poets who were in Bombay, the modernists who were in Bombay at that time, who became mentors to many younger generation poets, but also very harsh mentors. Now, I remember something that Jeet and I were talking about. We had a conversation in Goa, and he said something very uncharitable about the Bombay poets, the big poets, right? Dom Moraes, Nizam Ezekiel. He said they were so harsh that it was impossible to start publishing anything at all. All of us really suffered for, because of the harsh criticism. We just thought ourselves to be nobodies. And he said it took a long time to come out of that extremely negative feeling about oneself and, lack of self-worth as a poet, and to actually start properly writing and publishing and editing. So how was your experience?
I mean, I know where Jeet is coming from, and we've often had this conversation. On the one hand, I think it was empowering in some way to know that one was heir to a living tradition of Anglophone poetry in the city. You actually had poets who would come to your school to read to you. So Gieve Patel, Nizam Ezekiel, they were part of my growing years. They used to come to school and read their work to us. They were alive. Just to know that you could be a poet and alive helped to know that. Because there's really, there's American research that claims that poets die sooner than other species of writers. So it was good to know that there were some living poets around. That was the good part. The not so good part, I think, and this was perhaps, I'm wondering whether this was actually generational. The fact that rigor, which I still think is hugely important in poetry, that rigor in some way was also conflated with being ungenerous. And I think it is possible, and this is my challenge, I think, for me and some of my own generation, how to combine generosity with
An insistence on rigor.
with an insistence on rigor. So how to be inclusive but not indiscriminate? I think this would be my challenge, but I do think that we grew up with a bunch of interesting people. What was interesting was that they were not in a hurry to be published. Publishers were few and far between. They were not chasing agents and publishers. In fact, you realize that just having a book out was no big deal. You had to actually earn your stripes as a poet. So that level of rigor, I think I'm grateful for. And I think in that sense, I'm the cusp generation between that and another generation for whom the social media made poetry immediately, it was something you could immediately share with people. That was not the scene I grew up as heir to. It's strange. It makes me wonder which generation I really identify with. Probably neither. And in fact, it's the right note on which to read. May I read a poem from the book?
Yeah,
Yes.
poets,
I'd like
yes.
to actually read the very first poem from this book because it is about this cusp generation, what it felt like not quite belonging to a bunch of misanthropic poets, but not quite belonging to an era of self-congratulation either. Not quite sure how to navigate one's way. And it has a line from a poet who meant a great deal to me when growing up, was significant, let me say, in some ways. This is Eunice D'Souza. And I don't know how many of you have enjoyed the work of a poet and then made the mistake of meeting him or her. One often takes a lifetime to recover from that kind of anticlimax. So there's a lovely line in this Eunice poem where she says, best to meet in poems. And it's a line I hung on to for many years. I grew up in an age of poets. I grew up in an age of poets who told me the joy was for cabbages, until I found that beneath their smoking empires of sulfur, there lay a shiver of doubt. That they wondered, as I did, about what it might mean to be leafy, to wilt, to be damaged sometimes by upstart caterpillars, but still stay green, chaotically, wetly, powerfully green. Now, I meet poets who exchange visiting cards, are best friends with the dentist, all dankness deodorized, their poems cool seashells, their laughter splintered eggshells. Poets who never seem to wonder about cabbages at all. Still best to meet in poems. Maybe that's the poem to have concluded with and vanished from the scene.
Not really. We still have long to hear from you. This is the book actually that she's read from. This is Arundhathi's latest book, Love Without a Story. Now this has diverse kinds of poems, and she brings back actually a bit of bhakti in this in this wonderful long poem called The Fine Art of Aging. And Avayar, there is actually Avayar there. There is the boy Krishna there. There is a boy who may be Krishna, who may not be Krishna. There is the celebration of the everyday. There is apart from, of course, also personal lyrical poems and place poems, poems of journeys. So it's a kind of diverse. It's a book of diverse poems. But Avayar. Now when you're looking at characters, from whether they're mythical characters, fictional characters, historical characters, one wants, there are several dead people one likes to bring back to life. So is Avayar one of them? And what are you actually doing here in the poem? And I'd like you to read from it.
It's a good question. I sometimes think when I look back on I think it was the second book of poems, there was already in a very nascent form a figure who's now become a constant actually, or a regular in a lot of my work. And that is the figure of the female vagabond, the woman traveler. And as I grow older, I guess I found myself preoccupied also with the notion of the crone, the old woman, and what kind of wisdom, what kind of understanding of the world that figure represents. So Avayar suggested herself because she spoke to all these areas of curiosity. She is a woman poet from my part of the world. She's a Tamil woman poet, legendary. She's almost mythic. You really don't know which Avayar. There were 3 Avayars. You really don't know which one did what. There are many stories associated with each of them. So I was interested in her as a woman poet. I was interested in her as a traveler. And I was interested in her as the old woman. And I realized I needed to follow her. And I did through 7 poems. I needed to follow her to understand the kind of insights that she might bring to my own life about quest, about time, and about aging. That's where it happened.
It's a beautiful long series. Anybody who loves poetry here must read this beautiful long poem. It's my favorite from the book, The Fine Art of Aging.
You know, when I was asked about the title of this particular poem, of this particular book, which is called Love Without a Story, I often quote just few lines from this particular poem. And that's this. When people say, why did you call it Love Without a Story? I imagine Avayar telling us this. She says, for lovers, flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the book, love without a story. And that became my entry point into Avayar. I was curious about this woman who, unlike Yayati of Indian myth, doesn't choose to yearn for youth. So I say here that she is not interested in being conqueror of free radicals, victor of fine lines, high on a son's sacrifice, women, fine wines, collagen, spirulina, vitamin E, macadamia nuts, extracts of green tea, triclosan, selenium, propylene glycol, alpha hydroxy acids, bergamot, retinol. All these are, of course, the ingredients of skin creams. And it was such fun to create a litany of all those ingredients that Avayar I see as a person who chooses to disavow. She chooses something else. Avayar makes another choice. Fearless friend to gods, ally of peasants, counselor to kings, traveler of the darkest streets. She walks the world alone. And on such a path, she says, it's best to be a crone. And here comes the particular section that I'd like to read to you, which is, I see as Avayar's insights into the world she lives in. This is Avayar's worldview. Avayar knows that tyrannical algebra teachers die. And timid cleaning ladies with floral aprons too. She knows oligarchic poets blur into fussy grandpas. Dashing bankers get dementia. And the prettiest girls in class slash their wrists in beach homes, felled by boredom and barbiturates. She knows that the aging ustad is eventually ousted by triglycerides and court politics, and by the silent acolyte with smoldering eyes and humid palms. She knows that every court must have its oily pandit, its bleating groupies, its sullen cavillers, its jester stoned on his own demagoguery. She knows that every sangha has its Devadatta, plotting his coup in a blue swirl of power lust. She knows that everyone, everywhere believes they've been wronged, that history was written by someone else, and that they're always right. And incidentally, the god in that particular poem is Murugan. It's Murugan.
Yeah, the boy god.
The boy god. I see her. Let me just say this about Avaya, just to do her justice. We talked of Akka Mahadevi, we talked of these earlier women mystics who shed a great deal, including their clothes. I see Avayar as shedding youth, clearly. She also sheds other things. She sheds the need to impress. I see her as a traveler who's not looking for a single point. She knows, she says, she knows that the point is just a shared fruit and laughter. She knows there's no sadly or happily ever after. And she's happy to be a vagabond because she's not trying to make a deal. She's not looking for a bargain. She's not looking for an invitation. She is happy to have those conversations with that boy god, and that's quite enough.
This also brings me to the ordinary that you celebrate a lot in your work. Since there is actually, you have several kinds of journeys in your poems, Arundhathi, that I see. There is the actual physical journey of going from one place to the other. There is an inner journey, right? There is an inner journey in time. There is an inner journey in what one can perhaps call a transcendental space. And you engage with time in very different ways. You do have poems to your parents, for example. You have Finding Dad, you have another poem dedicated to parents too. There is the poem to your mother, Sharecropping. There is When a Landscape is a Woman. There's, you engage with actually the personal in terms of time, right? And that's not necessarily chronological time, but it can actually be a chronic time. It's a time of coming to terms with several things, a time of coming to terms with older generations, whether that of poets or that of one's own ancestors. There is a coming to terms with in your poetry and trying to engage with. And I also see a certain kind of trying to understand the process of aging, the process of perhaps moving to another stage of life. And when you're writing about aging, even in a poem like Epigrams for Life After 40, there is actually a kind of there is a bit of disquiet at the process of aging. There is an attempt to try and understand what aging means, coming to terms with ancestors, with other generations, with others who have gone before, with other spaces that they have tread. So it would be really nice if you could actually talk a bit about a sort of inner journey, an inner temporal journey that you undertake, and maybe perhaps read a couple of poems.
So lots of interesting points there, and I'm trying to think of which to pick up on. Several. Thank you for that. I'd say that in some ways I see that the fundamental preoccupation of the lyric poem really is time. I'm drawn to the lyric poem for that reason. The lyric poem is an invitation. I always say that the reason I'm actually impatient let me put it this way, impatient with novels at this point in my life, and I have been for almost 20 years, is because I've loved novels, they still sustain me on occasion, but there is a great seduction. The seduction of narrative is that it is constantly pulling you from beginning to middle to end. Whereas the invitation of the lyric poem, it always seems to me, is one to inhabit this moment deeply and fully. And in that sense, it's a more vertical engagement with reality rather than a horizontal one. And the lyric poem, I think, has figured out that the more deeply you engage with the personal, the local, the specific, the concrete, the more universal, in fact, you become. But you're not trying to leap to the generality, you're actually digging deep into this particular, into this intensely concrete instance. That's to me what excites me about the Bhakti poets, that they can be as audaciously local and universal at the same time. So they can talk about a Shiva who lives in Kailash, and they can also talk about a Shiva who walks down their street. That quality, that kind of localness of the divine is what draws me to them. So I'd say that you're absolutely right. There's been a preoccupation with time, with aging, all of that. And that's probably what draws me to the lyric poem, because it seems to me that the lyric poem is a form which I'm growing more and more aware of now as a form that is always aching. It understands gravity, but it's also aching to leap off a page. That tension between gravity and aeriality, to me, is the tension of the lyric poem, really. That there is a sense of the inevitable about it, that's its rhythm and its cadence, and there's also that sense of surprise, because this is language that is on some level, for all its terrestrial nature, it is unpredictable language, it's fluid, it's mercurial, it's startling. That to me is essentially because of this quality of the poem, I think, of the lyric.
Since we are talking about the lyric and time and aging, can I ask you to read one of my personally favorite poems, also because I turned 40 not that long ago. And this poem actually really speaks to me. Epigrams for Life After 40.
Why don't I ask you to read it?
If I can do justice
Please.
to it. Epigrams for Life After 40. Between the doorbell and the death knell is the tax exemption certificate. There are fewer capital letters than we supposed. Other people's stories will do. Sticky nuggety green and pink stories, other people's stories. Untenanting is more difficult than unbelonging. The body, the same alignment of flesh, bone, the scent of soap, yesterday's headlines, a soupçon of opera, but there are choices other than cringing vassal state and walled medieval town. And there is a language of aftermath, a language of ocean and fluttering sail, of fishing villages, malabared by palm and dreams laced with arak and moonlight. And it can even be enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll stay with the lyric for a while, actually. I think it's nice to be at this point where we are redefining the lyric, and we are unlyricking the lyric, actually, by making it about a lot more than just the personal and just the autobiographical. So in this idea of reckoning with one's ancestors, you know, she's already read that beautiful poem of engaging with the older poets, the Bombay poets, to Bombay poets. It'll also be nice to hear her speak about and read from also Love Without a Story, Parents Too, And maybe when landscape becomes a woman, you can, yeah.
How are we doing for time, Sabitha?
We have 20 minutes left.
We have 20 minutes.
No,
That's wonderful. Huh?
We have another 10 minutes for the conversation and then questions.
Oh, okay. Okay. I just have to read, right? I don't have to say anything at this point.
Well, you can read.
I'm not sure I need to say much. In fact, I'd like to read Parents 1 perhaps here.
Okay.
Because in this particular book, there are poems about abrupt disappearances. Parents vanish abruptly, don't they? Parents, they vanish as abruptly as they appear, busy perfecting the art of truancy when they send you away to school. They cry wolf many times over. But when you turn for a moment, they melt away, velvet-pawed, sure-footed, into the night. And I'm going to move to this particular poem about my mother. And this is the kind of poem I mean when we were talking earlier about the lyric poem, Sabitha. For me, really, when we're talking also about the personal, and you mentioned the autobiographical, I often say, I remember in my very first book, I had a poem to my sister, addressed, it was called Sister. And I know someone who came up to me afterwards and said, oh, now I know exactly what your relationship with your sister is like, this ambivalence with your sister. And my response to that was that I really don't know if my sister would recognize herself in this poem. Because that is the business of poetry, isn't it? You are fictionalizing all the time. You're lying honestly, or you're being truthful dishonestly, however you choose to look at it. So that is part of the whole making of a poem, that it is self-revelation and composition, self-composition, all at once. So even the subjects are not necessarily people who would recognize themselves in the poems. I'd make that distinction between the personal poem, which adopts the personal mode, and the autobiographical. What is autobiographical is a separate mode altogether. The personal is not necessarily true to the facts of your life. With that, I'd like to read a poem about my mother who actually says she recognizes some facts in this poem. So maybe I'm actually beginning to bridge the two modes in this one. I don't know how many of you felt this way growing up. For me, for a very long time, and maybe some of you will recognize this feeling. Growing up, it seemed like parents were just the landscape of my life. I really didn't think of them as individuals. They were the ground beneath my feet, the walls behind my back. They were really not people. But there comes a moment, and this happened for me vividly, when a bit of that landscape disengages itself, and suddenly you realize, my God, this is an ontological entity in its own right. This is a parent. When landscape becomes woman. I was 8 when I looked through a keyhole and saw my mother in the drawing room in her hibiscus silk sari, her fingers slender around a glass of iced cola. And I grew suddenly shy for not having seen her before. I knew her well, of course. Serene undulation of blue malmal, wrist serrated by thin gold bangle, gentle convexity of mole on upper right arm, and her high arched feet, better than I knew myself. And I knew her voice like running water, ice cubes in cola. But through the keyhole at the grown-up party, she was no longer geography. She seemed to know just how to incline her neck, just when to sip her swirly drink, and she understood the language of lacquered nails and baritone voices and words like emergency. I could have watched her all night. And that's how I discovered that keyholes always reveal more than doorways. That a chink in the wall is all you need to tumble into a parallel universe. That mothers are women.
I had actually thought that perhaps we would end there, but no. We do have a bit more time. So it will be nice to perhaps read from or read the entire Finding Dad. And we will actually end with an ode to the ordinary. I'm sure many of you sitting here, you know that Pablo Neruda is almost a Malayali poet. He's an extremely popular poet in Kerala. He was translated into Malayalam beautifully by Sachidanandan and also by Ayyappa Panikkar, and several younger poets, including myself, who came later. But so Neruda is almost a Malayalam poet. And Neruda has these wonderful elementary odes, right? I mean, there are odes to the everyday. There is, the ode to salt. There is the ode to ironing. There is the ode to what are the other odes actually? All the elementary odes, basically. So they celebrate the ordinary, right? And here is a beautiful poem by Arundhathi that celebrates the average, not the ordinary, but the average. So this is actually about children who don't necessarily have the highest marks in class or whatever, but that this celebrates actually the person who the self. It's very interesting that you spoke about how the new generation of writers, there's this whole element of glamour that they're going after. There's social media. There's a kind of chasing after fame and reputation and things like that. And here are you celebrating those who do not chase, those who do not aggressively chase dreams, but are content to stay who they are and content to come to terms with who they are and actually celebrate themselves as they are. So here is not just the ordinary, but the average.
If you can find me that poem, I'm happy to read it.
I speak for those with orange lunch boxes.
Let me say that, because you mentioned Neruda as well, I must say here, the poem that comes to mind for me is in fact Satchi's Stammer, which is for me an all-time favorite poem. I'd rank it among some of my favorite poems of all time. Stammer is again a poem about this. It is about this kind of brokenness, ordinariness, brokenness as deeply human, imperfection as deeply human. And I don't think there's any end to the anthems one can write about that. But let me also say that I have a rage poem that I often read, which I'm not going to read now, but it's a rage poem from my second book called To the Welsh Critic Who Doesn't Find Me Identifiably Indian. And it's one long rant of a poem, an overtly political poem, and I enjoy reading it, and I'm glad I wrote it. But there came a time when I asked myself, when I'm not ranting at Welsh critics or at some equivalent of them. What was that? Okay. When I'm not ranting at Welsh critics, who am I? When I'm not reacting to a world that's propelling me towards a definition that I find distasteful, who am I? How would I define myself? And particularly when everyone seems to be espousing a cause, I started asking myself, what is the cause that I would espouse? What is the constituency that would make the mistake of electing me as its representative? Who can I be a spokesperson for? So it was actually becoming a spokesperson for this particular tribe. For me, this was my tribe, and finding that tribe suddenly felt liberating. And I realized I could write an anthem, but a quiet anthem. And that for me was a breakthrough personally as well. I speak for those with orange lunchboxes. I speak for those with orange lunchboxes who play third tree in an orchard of 8 in the annual school play, who aren't head girls, games captains, class monitors, who watch other girls fight for the seesaw from the far wall across the sandpit, who remember everyone's lines but their own, who pelt after the school bus, their mother's breakfast still lurching in their gut, who still believe there'll be exams one day that they'll be ready for. Those with orange lunchboxes. I speak for them.
Thank you very much, Arundhathi, for a wonderful, engaging session, which is, which speaks about not just the personal, but also the transgressively political in the intimacy of poetry. We would take questions from the audience for about 8 minutes or so. So I think we have time for about 3 or 4 questions.
Is that what you came and whispered into your ear? Okay.
Hi, ma'am. Actually, you mentioned poetry being read through the internet these days, so I just feel like mentioning the first poem I read by you was read through the internet. My friend shared it with me. It was the Home poem that I first read. So what I wanted to ask is about transcending the self that you were talking about. So we see different kind of movements following the same idea, be it the transcendentalist movement in America or romanticism, all these. So all of them take a very different approach, mainly to the same end, as in the end is basically transcending the self.
Did I talk of transcending the self?
No,
Not
like
quite.
so through the mystic. No, I'm
Okay.
just, so what I'm asking is there a right way, or is there a course, as you said, a course to follow? I mean, if we read Emerson's or Thoreau, it's like they do it through the nature. So, and you were talking about this mystic power or God. So I just wanted to ask about that.
No, it's a good question, except that I usually try to make sure I don't use the word transcend the self, the word transcend, only because I think it's been used so much. There is the tendency to just overuse the word, just like the word God. You know, we approach it with some caution. It took me a long time to approach the word love, for instance, because these are overused words, so we try to approach it with some care. Since you mentioned several poets, let me go back to what I talked of earlier, which is the Bhakti poets. I'm not even talking about myself here. What drew me to them? Many things, the directness and the imperiousness of the voice, the direct mode of address, all of that. But what also draws me to them in some of their finest work is that they're not inviting us to transcend, but they're actually suggesting that in engaging deeply with this materiality, transformation happens. So it is not in, the reason I'm apprehensive about using a word like transcend is because it also suggests very often denying, amputating, severing, which is not the invitation of the finest Bhakti poets. It's certainly not the invitation of Tantra, and literature that has understood that in some way. Instead, the invitation is to inhabit deeply in order to transform. So the Bhakti poets tell us that if you carry the fire of Bhakti into the most festering crevice in human consciousness, that will be transformed. So you can rage at God knowing that that rage will be transformed. You can rage, you can love, you can do what you want, because that will all be transformed by the fire of Bhakti. That's the alchemy of Bhakti, but you could just as well say that is the alchemy of poetry. Isn't it? I mean, everyone who's written even a page in a journal knows that you may start at the top of the page in a state of great anger. By the time you reach the end, something has shifted. Yeah? So I think we all know intuitively this alchemy, and we find it in our own ways. So I would certainly not prescribe anything to you. I'd say find it for yourself. Yeah?
Thank you so much. Is this on?
Yes. Yes, Annie, it is on.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you so much. It was very, very engaging discussion. And I was especially struck by your crone poems. They had a different voice, it seemed to me. You were using rhyme. You seemed to let go more, let your hair down, so to speak. And I wonder, do you use other personas when you write? And did you feel a different sense that there was a different aspect of your own voice coming out in the persona poem?
That's a wonderful question. And I would actually have loved to read you some other persona poems in the earlier book as well. In a reading, you can only read little pellets of poetry and hope that they invite a reader to pick up the book. But I think, we talked about journeys, and I think both these two books that she has here, the last two books, have been about journeys, real and mythic. So whenever the mythic figure enters, Avayar in this particular book, but in the previous book there is Shakuntala, the classical heroine, but who is not presented in this kind of decorative fashion in that cycle of poems. I see her instead, and in that cycle, I see her as this woman who seems to be like a recipe for disaster, a calamity, because she never quite knows where she belongs, whether it's to the forest or the city, whether it's to the hermitage or the court, whether it's to earth or sky. She's a genetic disaster because she's born of a rishi and apsara. That's as confused as you can get. So I started writing that cycle saying, I'm going to address this walking calamity of a woman, until I realized that the reason I was so drawn to her is because in some way she represented a fundamental human predicament, right? And I realized that this tug between flesh and spirit in some way is what excited me about her. And if I hadn't written those poems and explored Shakuntala's relationship with her father, with her lover, with her mother, if I hadn't written that cycle, I wouldn't have known what I did at the end of that cycle. At the end of that cycle, a certain shift happened, and I suddenly realized that this woman, whom I had seen as a walking conflict, was actually a tremendous possibility, because she was the bridge between all these diverse worlds. She looks for her home, she looks for the place where all these binaries can be healed, but she is the place. Self-evident perhaps, but I needed to write 8 poems to discover that. So I think likewise with Avayar, she lent herself to rhyme at one point, and there is rhyme at other parts of this book too, but they had to happen the way they did. They wouldn't have happened otherwise. And if I hadn't written all those 7 Avayar poems, I wouldn't have known what I essentially aspire to, and which I know is my fundamental aspiration today, which is the last 2 lines of that poem, which is, I'll read them here. Unhurried, forever out of step, always on time. That's the person I'd want to be.
So to be always on time is probably a virtue, and we must end the session here. If you have other questions, please catch her outside and ask her that. Arundhati, thank you so much for a wonderful
Thank you, Sabitha. Thank you for that very attentive reading. And I'm looking forward to reading Sabitha's own book, which is to be released next month. That's something to look forward to as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arundhati.